A solid 9 question mark months ago, I created a video where I attempted underline, italics, bold to explain gender. And I did my best with avoiding the gender dysphoria topic and also avoiding how I think the brain scans are absolute horseshit. In that video, I also got into the topic about how sex is also a spectrum, and to absolutely nobody's surprise, cis people and some true scum went absolutely bonkers. And I kind of expected that because people are weird about this topic. Like, really fucking weird about this topic. And, well, I gave the surface level argument, and when you give the surface level argument, I suppose you should expect surface level counterclaims at that point. I guess I should expect it. Shouldn't expect anything good on the internet ever. So here's the deep analysis. Basically, I will be debunking the binary sex argument. Now, I think we should first establish, apparently, because people that speak English as their first language don't know your Greek and Latin roots and what they mean, binary means two groups. What? If you speak English as your first language and you did not know bi meant two, and binary means two groups, I'm judging you. Here's the thing. People were like, well, actually sex is a binary. Because I said sex wasn't binary in the video. You do realize not binary means more than two groups, right? Like, the existence of intersex people already destroys what you said, and I will get into more in-depth outside of intersex people, but already what you said was horseshit. So I will not be having semantic debates about what binary or spectrum means when you don't obviously know what it means. Google shit before you say things. One motherfucker went, actually, men can't lactate. And I am begging some of you to just use Google. First graders, fuck it, 4-year-olds do it all the time. It is such an easy skill to have to be able to Google things. Google, can men lactate? It will come up in a nice little box. Google will bold words for you. So before you say anything dumb, please look it up. I'm begging you. Before we start, I will only be talking about sex. I will not be talking about gender in this video. If I'm talking about gender in this video, I will preface it beforehand, but I will be using the terms male and female, mostly out of the lack of language I have to describe what I want to describe. Don't use that as a haha got you, you only used those two words, therefore it's a binary. Like, sir, I don't have the language to describe what I want to describe outside of those two words. Sit down. Be quiet. First thing we need to establish. Sex is not just your fucking chromosomes. For the love of God, stop saying shit like that. Biologists agree there are 5 facets of sex. Hormones, primary sex characteristics, gonads, which can also be considered primary sex characteristics, but they have their own category for a reason. Chromosomes, and secondary sex characteristics. If your argument does not encompass all 5 of these categories, it's immediately irrelevant to me. I don't care about your definition of sex, because your definition of sex is what you're feeling on the inside. Biologists say that there are 5 facets to sex. You don't just get to go, actually, I think it's only chromosomes. Like, I don't care what you think. Where's your fucking PhD? And each and every one of these categories are either on a spectrum or just don't have 2 categories. Bodies, get this, are kinda complicated. Bodies are very complicated, but because they're so complicated, shit does weird shit sometimes. Stuff does not always go how you think it's gonna go, because nature is chaotic. But let's get into each of these categories and talk about how they're a spectrum and or how they don't always just go in one or 2 ways. Hormones. This one is the easiest one. There are 3 sex hormones, and we all have different levels of them. No matter if you are considered male or female, you have different levels of these hormones in comparison to your peers. Testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. Because the numbers are different dependent upon the person, that's on a spectrum. In order for it not to be a spectrum, everybody's numbers would have to be the exact same, which is not fucking possible. If you take a blood test of one man and take the blood test of another man, you will get two different results. So if one man has maybe like more testosterone, does that make him more of a male? If one male has more estrogen, are they more female? In order to argue a binary, you would have to argue that hormones need to be one certain way, one way or another. But that's not possible, as we've discussed, because everybody has different numbers when you measure it. But also you would need to argue that your sex changes as your hormones change. So if I eat an almond, am I more male? Because the food you eat will mess with your hormones. If I'm gonna eat some tofu later, am I gonna be more female? And to argue that sex is a binary, you would need to argue that your sex changes with your hormones. But at the same time, that also invalidates your argument because it can only go one way or the other, right? Where would this person go? Hormones don't follow your nice little groups that you want to have, apparently. Number 2, primary sex characteristics. Now, let's address the obvious reason that this is not necessarily two groups is because intersex people exist. There are people that might have female-looking genitals but have male-looking internal genitals, or, they have both testicles and ovaries, or, they don't even have an opening anywhere if they're considered female. There's lots of different genital situations that exist. But even so, all genitals come in different shapes, sizes, and functions. They all come from the same building blocks, if that makes sense. We all start out as female in the womb. Everything a typical male has is some grotesque form of what that female form had. That's right, lads. Your peni? That's a clitoris. I hate to fucking break it to some of you, but your dicks are not that special. Your dicks are just very large, grotesque clitorises, and your clitoris is a micropenis. It's the same body molded by hormones, for the most part. We'll get into where the chromosomes come in later. But specifically in relation to the clitoris and penis, it is essentially only hormones that decided that factor. Even so, even if we are from the same building blocks, just sort of built differently, what happens when you need to get your uterus removed? What happens if you need to get your prostate removed? What happens? In order to argue that sex is a binary, you would need to argue that they can either only go in either one or the other, and all of these need to be congruent with one another. But then what happens when they get their prostate removed? Well, they aren't congruent anymore. It's not one or the other anymore. What do you do then? You would have to argue that removing one's uterus would make them not female anymore, but they also can't be male according to you because the rest of their factors aren't congruent with that. So what happens then? This is a spectrum in how intersex people exist and how genitals all function differently. If someone has a uterus and doesn't have regular periods, are they less female? If someone is infertile and considered a male, are they less male? What's the procedure here? The fact of the matter is, genitals all look different dependent upon random different factors. They all function differently. And it's not in one or two categories. It's on a wide range of different conditions and situations that are a lot more common than you think they are. Gonads. Gonads are like, ovaries or testicles. Fun fact, your testicles are just outside ovaries. Your ovaries are just inside testes. So once again, we come from the same blueprint, built differently. The Legos are put into different places, but they're the same Legos. But anyways, gonads are literally the only important thing directly determined by your chromosomes. Gonads are a product of your X or Y. However, with that being said, the Y chromosome isn't as powerful as you think it is. The Y chromosome needs two other chromosomes in order to make testicles. So without those two other chromosomes, it wouldn't happen. This is from the National Geographic. As embryos, our gonads aren't specific to either gender. Their default course is a female one, but they can be diverted through the action of a gene called SRI that sits on the Y chromosome. SRI activates another gene called SOX9, which sets off a chain reaction of flipped genetic switches. The result is that premature gonads develop into testes. Without SRI or SOX9, you would get ovaries instead. So you have a Y chromosome, but your SRI or SOX9 gene doesn't work. Congrats, you have XY chromosomes, but no testicles. What do you do now? The Y chromosome and the X chromosome aren't as powerful as you like to think they are. They need other genes to do their thing. For instance, the ovaries, in order to fight off the SOX9 chromosome from creating testicles, the ovaries have an FOXL2 gene that is keeping your ovaries there. It is thought that if you had that gene removed, you would grow testicles. It worked on mice. It has not been tested upon humans. However, that's the theory, is that if they took your FOXL2 gene and you have ovaries, they would become testicles. So this rant is just to say, like, gonads are the only thing that kind of, like, are directly affected by the chromosome, but, like, the chromosome is not as powerful by itself as you think it is. It's a spectrum in the intersex category, once again, but to ask the question again, if someone gets their testicles removed for cancer reasons, are they no longer male? If someone gets their ovaries removed for plenty of different reasons, are they no longer female? Because once again, you could not argue a binary sex without arguing that these situations would change your sex, even though that would also contradict your own argument in itself. And you know, with the intersex situations, sometimes you have neither ovaries or testicles, sometimes you got testicles, sometimes you got ovaries, sometimes you got both. That's possible. Sometimes you got like half testes. Shit happens. There are a lot more situations than just two. Mind you, they all function differently. What if your ovaries don't function the same way that you think they should? Or the testicles don't function the same way that you think they should? That's also on a spectrum, because shit works differently dependent upon the person. The fun one that everybody likes to fall back on, chromosomes. You see, it's funny that everyone likes to fall back on this one for their binary sex argument, because this is one of the easier ones to explain the spectrum, because it's not just XX and XY. There are tons of different situations. It goes up to like 6, like XXYYYY, or X, or XXX, or XXXX, or XXXY. Fun fact, you don't know what your chromosomes look like unless you get it tested. You may not have the chromosomes you think you have, because even if you have these divergent chromosomes, it may not even result in a divergent set of sex characteristics. Or you do have divergent chromosomes, and you do have a divergent set of sex characteristics. Or you have your average set of chromosomes, but you do have divergent sex characteristics. Hey guys, it's complicated. Bodies don't work the way you think they should sometimes. But even so, a lot of your sex characteristics are determined by hormones, if anything. Like I said, the only thing directly affected by chromosomes, and only chromosomes, is your gonads. Other than that, hormones are like a huge player in this, and people do not give them the credit that they deserve. There's lots of different chromosome pairs, and there's lots of different effects of that. Even if you have a certain chromosome pair, there's no way to tell how your body's gonna react to it, because shit gets wild. This is from the NHS. Some people have XX chromosomes with ovaries and a womb, but their genitals may not look the same as many females. For example, they may have a more developed clitoris, and their vagina may be closed. Doctors refer to this condition as 46XX-DSD. So even if you have average chromosomes, it may not develop that way. Chromosomes do shit, and then your body does shit. Shit's weird. And like I said before, there are situations where you have XY chromosomes and your outside genitals look like that of someone who is a typical female, but your internal structures are typically male. Chromosomes and primary sex characteristics and gonads are very weird, and they do weird things sometimes, and they go in lots of different directions for no goddamn reason, because bodies are complicated. And last but not least, the easiest one to talk about, secondary sex characteristics. I feel like you know where I'm going with this. Secondary sex characteristics can be anything from like your fucking height to the width of your hips to, you know, how big your titties are. Bro, that is on a huge fucking spectrum. Am I more female because I'm short? I have wide hips. Am I more female? But I'm hairy. Am I more male then? What's the procedure? Because that's on a huge spectrum. If a dude can't put on muscle, are they female? And it's directly correlated with hormones, which is also very obviously on a spectrum. Also, when talking about secondary sex characteristics, puberty is the second most important determining factor of sex after utero. People always forget puberty in this conversation, and it's like, sex is not only determined in the womb, sex is also determined during puberty. For instance, there are some intersex conditions that don't show themselves until puberty hits. Puberty is also important and needs to be taken into account in this conversation because it's like the second half of the determining of your sex characteristics. And sometimes people have a second puberty because they're trans. Shit happens. And another thing we should talk about is, like I said before, all of our titties are the same. We have the same titties. For the most part, everybody got titties. They're just different sizes. We all lactate. Really, what determines your titties is the hormones. Shit's wild. I don't even need to go further on this, because this one's very obviously a spectrum. Secondary sex characteristics are a huge fucking part of sex, and not acknowledging them is blatantly ignoring an important category of sex. You can't ignore them in your argument, or I am not going to respect it. So sex is a spectrum, obviously, because intersex people exist. That alone is why it's not a binary, because binary means two groups only underline, but like intersex people exist. So that kind of destroys that. So I really could have just said intersex people exist and ended the video, but I went into the, deeper argument. The way certain sex characteristics from any of these categories form is just different in every person. To say that these 5 wildly different categories that manifest differently in everyone can be put into 2 distinct groups is just, it's absolutely ludicrous. Saying that all 5 of these categories are congruent with each other, one way or the other, every time, is just not true. Hence why sex is a spectrum. Because in order to say sex is a binary, you would need to say that all 5 of these categories are congruent with one another one of 2 ways. But that's not how it works. I'm already an example. Maybe 4 of my categories are congruent, but like, I'm short, I have a high voice, I have wide hips. What do I do about my secondary sex characteristics? That's not congruent with the rest. Or, you got a female friend that 4 of the categories are congruent, but like, she needed to get her uterus removed because of cancer. Well, what do you do now? They aren't all congruent now. That's why it's not one or the other, because there are 5 distinct categories you need to take into account that don't always agree with your binary. Hence why it is a spectrum, because some people will have 4 congruent categories and 1 non-congruent category, or maybe 2, or maybe 3. And even within the category, it's on a spectrum as well. And, even with secondary sex characteristics, that's very subjective. It's not nice like you want it to be. Sex is a spectrum because there's way too many fucking categories and situations that don't align with what you were trying to sell to me here. In conclusion, we are just a bunch of formless blobs that all develop on an individual basis from one set of Legos, and in the right conditions, we can make babies sometimes.